Okay, well, thank you so much. Now, I hope the number of people standing at these microphones is not representative, because I'm sure many of you have many questions, so please do come up. Sir. And please, of course, introduce yourselves before asking a question, and then make sure the question, as I no doubt you all know, is a question.
Good afternoon. I'm Chick Nelson, Vice President of the Institute of Peace. I've thought about Rwanda for some time. Most of the discussion this afternoon is focused on 1993 and 1994. Relationships between the Tutsis and the Hutus were tense and in conflict for, you name the number of centuries. What could the international community do, say, from 1962 on when independence arrived, or 1917 when the Belgians were given the control over, or the pre-colonial period when the Tutsis had a more or less feudal control over the area? I assume sometime back in there, you can't, the international community obviously can't act on every potential conflict. But I like to think we could have done something before 1993.
General Dallaire?
The question is often raised is when did the genocide really start, or where were the real seeds of the genocide? Was it in 1959 when they got independence, or as you're saying back, or was it in 1990 when the RPF attacked and created more friction? But it is interesting that in Rwanda, Rwanda was receiving proportionally the highest amount of aid that Canada put into Africa. The Pope was in Rwanda in 1992 visiting. The president was a religious practicing person, but the Catholic Church in Rwanda ultimately was involved in instilling the differences between the two ethnicities, and in fact, Hutus got a significant advantage. So, in sitting with Juan Mendes and David Hamburg and others, Dr. Luck and Francis Deng at the UN with Kofi Annan, and now with the new Secretary General, and we're trying to figure out how do you do genocide prevention, because we're the first body to actually think about genocide, be instituted to advise on genocide prevention. And so the question is, where was that start point? Where was that trigger point that we should have intervened? And I would contend humbly from my knowledge of Rwanda is when we decided to back the dictatorial structure of the Habyarimana regime and got smoked under by the beautiful country and how it's well organized and so on, is when the seeds, real seeds of that genocide started, because it was an overt attack on human rights as we understand them today, and certainly were trying to articulate in those days. That's when we should have said, this is not right. So democracy, free elections, and all that stuff.
Yes.
Andy Loomis, U.S. State Department, formerly an academic, and which is sort of the nature of this conversation. This comment is more academic than representing the State Department. And the question is, or the presumption that often exists, and somewhat exists on this panel, is that there's often a strict firewall between humanitarian concerns or moral concerns that percolate among the public and cold national interest concerns that rest in the political elite. And there is a substantial body of research that suggests that one area in which moral concerns are really influential in foreign policy is the impact of the ability of the United States to influence its allies. On humanitarian concerns often has much more success with allies and where there are publics that are much more active and concerned about these issues. And whenever the U.S. leadership is more sort of considered to be acting on cold national calculation, it's often harder to develop its allies to follow along whenever the United States takes the lead. And I'm curious, I haven't read the report, I just picked it up, but I'm curious the extent to which you've considered, I know that this conversation has certainly been stalled in the area of is the public going to push the United States government or the Canadian government to move more proactively on prevention. And I'm curious if you've considered the effect on the U.S. leadership capacity and the role of humanitarian concerns on on that issue. Thank you.
Well, I guess that could be answered either by Dr. Chalk or General Dallaire.
Go ahead, Frank.
To answer your question briefly, our feeling is that it's absolutely vital to cooperate with allies and to do nothing that undermines our ability to work together with other countries in alliances looking towards constructive participation in genocide prevention. In fact, the second stage of this project is probably going to seek partners in South Africa and in Britain to do the will to intervene in those countries, with our local partners taking the lead in both countries to answer questions like that. But before those regional organizations and all of this leadership can be exercised, in each of those countries, we need to have a consensus at the highest levels of government that it is vital to prevent mass atrocities in the national interest of their country. Otherwise, everything will fall off the table when other issues and other crises arise. So I must say I'm looking forward to the second stage of the project, which is when we'll get to address that. But for the time being, I don't think the research has been done. I think we all know the problems that arise in cooperating with other countries in Iraq and Afghanistan, etc., and which arose in Yugoslavia and elsewhere. If I could just add one footnote to your question. When we talk about the African Union, do we all recognize that we're talking about a regional organization, a large part of whose budget is funded by Libya, which meets the targets and aims that General Gaddafi lays down, at least at the outset. They may negotiate, but at the outset. And we never want to get into a situation where we're partnered with a regional organization which has as its main goal implementing General Gaddafi's foreign policy agenda. So we have to watch out for the minefields out there when we do all this. At this stage, we have learned a lot about how the U.S. and Canada define their national interest, and the fact that no major power anteed up troops when the Rwanda crisis erupted, I think is telling. Indeed, President Mbeki, at the 10th commemoration of the Rwandan Genocide in 2004, apologized to the people of Rwanda for South Africa's failure to recognize the intensity and extent of the killings in Rwanda, and for South Africa's role in providing arms to the Habyarimana regime as well. So all of this is, in a way, it's much more relevant to the responsibility to protect agenda on the international level than our agenda, which is to look at domestic politics and domestic priorities.
Frank, let me stop you, Frank. We're running out of time. Yes, Mike.
I just want to maybe on a more practical and less academic level, at least in the Bush years, as related to Darfur, there was a broad unity of purpose between the Canadians, Great Britain, and the United States, often on these issues, and almost no interest in continental Europe of any kind. In fact, active hostility to any action through NATO that might have been helpful. I listened to the president talk to Chirac and Merkel and the EU General Secretary and all sorts of people, and there was a general indifference on that side. And we found the same in Africa, a very mixed picture, where the Nigerians, Rwandans, and others were often willing to be quite helpful and not on Libya's agenda, very, very helpful. And then South Africa continues to play that role in Africa, not just the one they played in '93. I mean, when you talk about actively welcome Bashir to South Africa, fed him, actively, I think, undermine kind of broader policy in Zimbabwe, play a role on the UN Security Council of all things of blocking action on Burma, which makes no sense to me whatsoever, And so it is, when you talk about the allies, it's a very, very mixed picture when you're trying to do it in reality.
All right, yes.
So my question relates...
Could please identify yourself.
I'm sorry, my name is Stephanie Yombaide, and my question relates to what you're talking about, and it's one about neutrality, or supposedly neutrality of intervention, and the other one about impunity. So when we're talking about, you mentioned the fact that the French intervention was questionable in its intent, and I'm just wondering, do you think that intervention should be neutral? Because there are some cases where the genocide has already happened, and in order to stop it, you have to pick one side or the other, the victim side or the perpetrator side. And nobody would have argued in the World War II that you should have negotiated with Hitler, you should have negotiated with the Nazis. So in cases where this is happening, how can this report address the fact that you can't intervene in neutrality, you have to pick a side? And the second question is about impunity. What John was talking about, you also need to be able to hold accountable the people who are doing this when you do pick sides. And we've seen with the French intervention in Rwanda that not only were they not neutral, but they also provided impunity that I think today can be looked at as an encouragement for others who are thinking of also committing genocide, and the same crimes are happening with FDLR and LRA.
Yes. And on the neutrality aspect, the minute you intervene, you become another belligerent. That is to say, another element of... so if you've got two belligerents and you're an intervention force, you're the third one in this, and you are susceptible to being attacked or having to fight or establish the atmosphere of security by taking on the other two. However, in the case of massive crimes against humanity that were going on, the fact that there were two armies, or more or less armies, facing each other in a war, and that front was moving, was not, to me, the aim of using the 5,000 troops that I needed. What my aim was is to go behind the lines and stop the slaughtering by the militias, by the locals, and by some of the militaries and so on, and the politicians who were encouraging that. So to go after them. That those two armies were fighting each other, that's up to them to solve. My problem was stopping that killing that had nothing to do with the actual fighting. And in so doing, stopping the massive movement of people. Because the civilian population in these conflicts are now tools of war. They're no more the bystanders and the innocent sort of refugees. I mean, these people want to use these massive amounts of people as bargaining chips in order to establish their power base, negotiation base, so on. So they were deliberately moving millions of people. And so the aim was to go in and to stop that. And if that meant taking on one side who was doing it, then that was part of the mandate. And in fact, that was the mission statement that I took on. That the minute we would intervene and we made it clear that we were there to stop the killing of the innocent population, and that there was any obstruction by either side, then we would then take the belligerents on as a second element. So I wasn't worried about stopping, how do you say that, peace negotiations, although I was doing that. My aim was to stop the slaughter, and that would have forced the people back to the negotiating table. And in the side of impunity, the ex-colonial powers of Europe have not expunged the colonial philosophy or even ways of thinking, and so there is a response. You could say the Brits that went in Sierra Leone was positive, but the Brits that went into Sierra Leone should have gone in with the UN, and we wouldn't have had the problem in the first place, and given them the mandate to do the job. And Sierra Leone is part of their ex-colonial stuff. The French went into Rwanda because they had an involvement there, and there was significant advantages that they thought by supporting that element. And so I believe in many countries participating. I believe in the UN, but I also believe that there is a requirement for many of those nations who have capabilities to them present a transparent option on the table, and not, in fact, hold the Security Council at ransom, as the French did with Turquoise.
Yes.
You
Rita Tobias from there. I'm a psychologist working for SPICI. It's the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. Our association strives to bring practical psychological science to the public policy debate. And my question is based on John's comment that there's now a growing tide of people who are interested in universal humanitarian values and of emotional connections to the people that are suffering in this world, and that the policy debates are nowadays also affected sometimes by serendipitous issues bubbling up to the top of the agenda. And so my question to the panelists is, what types of frames of the arguments that are being discussed here are most effective in enrolling the general public to demand a policy agenda that's different, or a political agenda that's different from what it is now, and that can then shape policies that are solving the root of the problems that we're discussing here. So this is to any of you.
Let me
Thank
throw
you.
in my 5 cents. It is my personal opinion that more and more power will come from the coalescing and the maturing of the NGO community. Mm-hmm. And I think that instead of things bubbling up, that you're actually going to see power bases that have no borders to them, most of them are without borders, that will in fact be able to influence even major powers in decisions in regards to the future of humanity and all human beings and human rights. And so I continue to encourage youth to get out, first of all, get your boots dirty, look at it, taste it, smell it, see it, feel it, and hear it, then come back and then become, not throwing cash at these things, but becoming intimately involved. And I'll end by the following, is we're seeing more and more youth, those under 30, creating NGOs, because the big ones are not meeting the requirements. And I think that is to me, the way of not simply things bubbling up, but in fact a power base that's actually pushing that stuff.
John?
I think there's 3 things. One is, that as Frank articulated it, you know, in the way he described, interestingly, the Marshall Plan sales job, and that is which requires leadership, which requires your leaders to actually be out ahead of the citizenry's understanding of the evolution of global affairs and the requirements of our international relations, our projection into the world. And so getting that kind of leadership from the President, from the Secretary of State, to articulate now why it matters to do these things in the context of our own security, human security, sustainable security context, which I think is the lingo these days. So that's one. Again, back to the eggs in the baskets, I think you got to do a few things. That's one. The second one, I just can't say enough about how important I think faith-based and student-based organizing is going to be going forward, more even than it has been in the development of social movements over the past century because of the internet. And I think that as you can, at any point in time, become connected directly to someone who is in a refugee camp or someone who is a survivor of a genocide or survivor of a mass rape campaign, a surviving former child soldier, you can connect with those people and then connect around real policy issues. What's different than 1994 is that organizations like that didn't exist. You had Alison DeForge and the Human Rights Watch effort, which was elite advocacy, speaking to a group inside the Beltway that didn't really want to do anything right then. And so now you have the establishment of a number of different organizations, or the expansion of existing mandates of existing organizations, to be much more engaging of a broader citizenry and helping to promote the development of a movement that focuses on policy change. And then finally, the third basket, I think the cost effectiveness one, which is referenced in this report, is utterly critical. And in an era where the budget issues are being used in many ways in the healthcare debate and other things very, very politically, you'd have to be foolish not to advance in this agenda one of our most important elements. We're throwing billions of dollars at treating symptoms in Congo and Sudan today, and we're not doing a damn thing about the causes. I mean, that's pretty pathetic, and that has to change, and we got to see that construct change. And so our advocacy of people like us in this room and the commission here to move forward has to make that cost effectiveness argument that I think would really it would catch with some audiences. So the point is, you develop different arguments for different audiences to promote that, and hope that the confluence of those arguments can be dispositive.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Eleanor Thompson. I'm a research associate with the Public International Law and Policy Group. My question is, or two questions, one geared toward prevention. There was a lot of emphasis on preventing mass atrocities as opposed to intervention after the fact. Lieutenant General Dallaire, you also alluded to the UN's Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide. How do you see any avenues for coordination between that office and mechanisms within the U.S. and Canadian governments, including possibly this NSC-run high-level committee on the prevention of mass atrocities, in monitoring and taking steps early on in the prevention of genocide? Secondly, it was also mentioned the U.S.'s role in coordinating the efforts of Rwanda, Uganda, and the DRC in going after the LRA. Given the failures of that effort, what are the next steps in terms of addressing the atrocities being committed by the LRA?
I'll go to the first one, and I'm humbled by the fact that Juan Mendez is here, but on two planes. The genocide prevention and the effort of prevention is on one plane trying to get the information from all the different sources, even within the UN, that is not necessarily exchanged in order to garner all the possible signs of a situation that can degenerate, where people are being identified and rendered ciblés by treating them as insects and so on, and then all the processes. So there's the genocide prevention is trying to get all the information from all the different UN agencies and departments to feed, so that you can collate that and actually see some trends that would permit you to go. In regards to the other countries and so on, one was invited to the Canadian all-party parliamentary group, that is both houses, genocide prevention organization that I created a couple of years ago, where we're just educating parliamentarians on genocide prevention, which seems to catch them always by surprise, that you actually could prevent some of this stuff. And that there are people who actually are trying to figure out ways of getting in there early to prevent, because their whole philosophy is one of reaction. They're crisis managers and short term. And so when you introduce something that they could actually go in and prevent something from happening, influencing international development money, influencing policy aid, and even training. My son is just back from 6 months in Sierra Leone as a captain, assisting that army trying to become a national army. All of them are ex-child soldiers, but they're not anymore. I mean, those things they can get engaged in, and so it's an education exercise that's absolutely required.
So our last question goes to my colleague at the Global Center, Nicole Dallaire.
I didn't plan that, but thank you, and thank you all. I'm with the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, and we're very much congratulate your efforts at tackling one of the, as we know, largest questions involved in the whole Responsibility to Protect endeavor. I'll ask a very specific question. As one of the priorities for the Global Center is to ensure that major bureaucracies are actually coordinating some of their responses. We've heard from several of the speakers how important it is to engage middle powers, how important it is that the United States has one message, but other permanent members of the Security Council have another agenda, and some of these crisis situation. So I would like to ask, back on the question of focusing on measures, what measures, short of military force, do we think we can get our allies and other members of the Security Council and influential actors to work behind collectively? Where do we see consensus that we as advocates can work toward? And thank you.
Well, that can be for any of you who feel moved to answer that question. Anyone?
Maybe I would start just by answering maybe the second part of the last question, the LRA question. And this, it's rare in a certain way. This case is rare because it is an instance of a charismatic leadership literally holding families hostages in order to, and taking whole schools as child soldiers, where direct action, we all talk about how military is always the last resort, but where direct action could actually make an extraordinary difference. We're not dealing with a broad popular movement, as maybe some of them once were in northern, Uganda, but it's nothing like that anymore. This is literally, charismatic, cult-related group with an imprisoned leadership, stealing children to displace people. And this is literally a case where I think the kind of, however it's done, but the action, I think direct action could be very, very useful. And those aren't the majority, but this is clearly a case when you're talking about next steps. I think that the coordinated effort that was attempted here had the right theory.
John, something between zero and military action that there might be some greater possibility of finding consensus behind?
If I can, which is not quite what you want from me, take this case and then add it to that last question and say, here are some of the tools, because they're not all military, but they require military action. You have, let's take the LRA and the FDLR cases, two of the great human rights challenges of our era, 1 million displaced human beings since January of this year. So it's the most compelling humanitarian crisis in the world, concentrated in a small space relative to the size of the globe. We need a comprehensive strategy. So, and many of the tools that I will reel off very quickly are, I hope, answers to the question that you're asking, Jim. First, not what an answer to what you're asking, is building on what Michael said was a failure, not a failure in the sense of, we blew it, but there was an investment by the Bush administration to build the capacity to go after the LRA. There was an effort. We just got to keep doing that. I mean, the first time, where you think you're going to catch, I mean, if we had gone home
Would've
after,
been nice,
in 2001, if we didn't succeed in the first effort for bin Laden, does that mean we just go home? I mean, this guy is continuing to do what he was doing for the last 20 years at horrifying humanitarian repercussions for people. So targeting that leadership of both the FDLR and LRA, building the capacity of those implementing partners, if you will, the Ugandan militaries, the Congolese military. These are long-term projects. They have better and worse troops. You build on the capacities of the ones that you can work with, and keep doing the intelligence and close and strike capacities. Give them some of the logistical support that they need, especially the air support, and do it. Second, though, now we get into some of the non-military aspects of dealing with mass atrocities as they exist in the world, not in some book. It's targeting the support lines that help sustain these groups. There are diaspora networks, very small percentage of the diaspora of these societies, who are actively raising money and supporting those groups. There is a government in the region, in Khartoum, that's actually helping to support the LRA and has done so. And there are economic relationships that we have in terms of our electronics products we use every day that sources some of their raw materials back to the mines in the Congo that are controlled by some of these armed groups. We can't just, let's see if one military strike will take these people out. There are complicated root causes of why these militias are able to do what they do and why mass atrocities exist in the world and how you counter them. So that's a second thing. A third thing is you got to care for the people who have been who have survived these things. So you have the majority child soldiers in both of these situations. You've got to construct the kind of what they call DDR programs, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration programs, not just on paper in a UNDP document in New York City or in the World Bank in Washington, but actually have some resources available to allow people to access a pull factor to allow people to exist now, but it will if we succeed in some of these cases over time. And then finally, the biggest, most vexing problem is when you do undertake these missions, when you take the stick and you go after the hornet in its nest, people are going to die by the thousands, tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands, as most of these kinds of groups will quickly turn on local populations, defenseless populations. Watch what the Sudanese government did the day after the ICC indicted Bashir. They cut off humanitarian aid. The day after this attempt to try to get Coney, those guys went straight for villages and started slaughtering people because they think we'll back off. And normally we do. So where's the resolve we need from the president? Where's the resolve we need from governments around the world to stand up, A, and not take that bait, and B, to help protect civilians? When you construct strategies, you've got to build the capacity to it, and that's a bread and butter military issue and police issue where you protect people where they are. So there's lots of things that we can do. Some of it involves military, some of it involves non-military. But I think, again, in the service of the law, the tool, if we build up these tools, people will go to them more and more frequently.
Well, I think we've now run 10 minutes over, so I think on that passionate note, we should stop. I want to thank our panelists for really a terrific presentation. And I'd also like to thank the USIP and, above all, the authors of Mobilizing the Will to Intervene, a report that I hope and trust will soon be paid close attention to by policymakers. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jim. Well done, sir. Well done.